A very warm welcome to today's study of the Book of Psalms. Today we will be looking at Psalm 31. May our thoughts, our words and our deeds be forever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Psalm 31. In you, O Lord, I have taken shelter. Never let me be humiliated. Vindicate me by rescuing me. Listen to me, quickly deliver me. Be my protector and refuge, a stronghold where I can be safe. For you are my high ridge and my stronghold. For the sake of your reputation, you lead me and guide me. You will free me from the net they hid for me, for you are my place of refuge. Into your hand I entrust my life. You will rescue me, O Lord, the faithful God. I hate those who serve worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will be happy and rejoice in your faithfulness, because you notice my pain, and you are aware of how distressed I am. You do not deliver me over to the power of the enemy. You enable me to stand in a wide open place. Have mercy on me, Lord, for I am in distress. My eyes grow dim from suffering. I have lost my strength. For my life nears its end in pain. My years draw to a close as I groan. My strength fails me because of my sin, and my bones become brittle. Because of all my enemies, people disdain me. My neighbours are appalled by my suffering. Those who know me are horrified by my condition. Those who see me in the street run away from me. I am forgotten, like a dead man no one thinks about. I am regarded as worthless, like a broken jar. For I hear what so many are saying, the terrifying news that comes from every direction. When they plot against me, they figure out how they might take my life. But I trust in you, O Lord. I declare you are my God. You determine my destiny. Rescue me from the power of my enemies and those who chase me. Smile on your servant. Deliver me because of your faithfulness. O Lord, do not let me be humiliated, for I call out to you. May evil men be humiliated. May they go wailing to the grave. May lying lips be silenced, lips that speak defiantly against the innocent with arrogance and contempt. How great is your favour, which you store up for your loyal followers. In plain sight of everyone, you bestow it on those who take shelter in you. You hide them with you, where they are safe from the attacks of men. You conceal them in a shelter, where they are safe from slanderous attacks. The Lord deserves praise, for he demonstrated his amazing faithfulness to me when I was besieged by enemies. I jumped to conclusions and said, I am cut off from your presence. But you heard my plea for mercy when I cried out to you for help. Love the Lord, all you faithful followers of his. The Lord protects those who have integrity, but he pays back in full the one who acts arrogantly. Be strong and confident, all you who wait on the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The swift transitions of feeling in this psalm may come across to us as strange, our lives run perhaps a little more smoothly, but reveal a brother soul to those who have known what it is to ride on the top of a wave and then to plummet into its trough. What is peculiar to the psalm is not only the inclusion of the whole gamut of feeling, but the force with which each key is struck, and the persistence through all of the one ground tone of cleaving to Jehovah. The poetic temperament passes quickly from hope to fear and back again. The devout man in sorrow can sometimes look away from a darkened earth to a bright sky, but the stem realities of pain and loss again force themselves upon him. The psalm is like an April day in which sunshine and rain chase each other across the plain. The beautiful uncertain weather, where gloom and glory meet together, makes the landscape live, and is the precursor of fruitfulness. The stream of the psalmist's thoughts turn in shadow of grim cliffs, and vexed by opposing rocks, and now opens out in sunny stretches of smoothness. But its source is, in you, Jehovah, I will take my refuge. And its end is, be strong. Let your heart take courage, all who believe and trust in Jehovah. The first turn of the stream we find in verses 1 to 4, and consists of petitions and their groans. The prayers reveal the suppliant's state. They are the familiar cries of an afflicted soul, common to many psalms and presenting no such special features. The needs of the human heart are uniform, and the cry of distress is much alike on all lips, regardless of time. The sufferer asks, as his fellows have done in the past and will do in the future, for deliverance, a swift answer, shelter, defence, guidance and leading, escape from the net spread out for him. These are the commonplaces of prayer which God is not wearied of hearing, and which fit all of us. The last place to look for originality is surely in the sighing of such as be sorrowful. The pleas on which the petitions rest are also familiar. The man who trusts in Jehovah has a right to expect that his trust will not be put to shame, since God is faithful. Therefore, the first plea is the psalmist's faith expressed in verse 1, by the word which literally means to flee to a refuge. The fact that he has done so makes his deliverance a work of God's righteousness. The metaphor latent in flee for refuge comes into full sight in the beautiful plea we find in verse 3, which an unsympathetic critic might call illogical. Be for me a refuge rock, for you are my rock. Be thou what thou art, manifest thyself to be what thou art in nature. Be what I, your poor servant, have taken you to be. My heart has clasped your revelation of yourself and fled to the strong tower. Let me not be deceived and find it incapable of sheltering me from my foes. So for your name's sake, or because of that revelation and for its glory is true in men's sight, deliver me. God's nature as revealed is the strongest plea with him, and surely that cannot but be potent and acceptable as a prayer, which says, be you what you are and what you have taught me to believe you to be. The next 4 verses prolong the tone of the preceding, but with a little difference, insofar as God's past acts are more specifically dwelt upon as the grounds of his confidence. In this turn of the stream, faith does not so much supplicate as meditate, picking the flower of confidence from the nettle of past danger and deliverance, and renewing its acts of surrender. The sacred words which Jesus made his own on the cross and which have been the last utterance of so many saints, were meant by the psalmist to apply to life and not to death. He laid his spirit as a precious deposit in God's hand, assured he was able to keep that which was committed to him. Often he has done this before, and now he does it once more. Petitions pass on into surrender. Resignation as well as confidence speaks. To lay one's life in God's hand is to leave the disposal of it to him, and such absolute submission must come as the calm close and incipient reward for every cry for deliverance. Trust should not be hard to those who can remember, and so Jehovah's past redemptions or deliverances from temporal danger are its ground here. And these work as pledges for the future, since he is the God of truth, who can never falsify his past. The more a soul clings to God, the more vehemently will it recoil from any other trust. Attraction and repulsion are equal and opposite. The more clearly it sees God's faithfulness and living power as a reality operating in its life, the more penetrating will be its detection of the false things of other helpers. Being a mere nothingness of emptiness, they are all to one who has felt the clasp of that great, tender hand. And unless the soul feels them to be such, it will never strongly clutch or firmly hold the true support. Such trust has its crown in joyful experience of God's mercy even before the actual deliverance comes to pass, as a wind-borne fragrance meets the traveller before he can even see the gardens from which it will come. The verbs in verse 7 may be petition, let me exult, or they may be anticipation of future gladness. But in either case, some waft of joy has already reached the singer. How could it fail to do so when his faith was renewing itself, his eyes gazing upon God's deeds of old? The past tenses of verses 7 and 8 refer to former experiences. God's sight of the psalmist's affliction was not an idle contemplation, but an implied active intervention. To take note of the distresses of my soul, or possibly of my soul and its distresses, is the same as to care for it. It is enough to know that God sees the secret sorrows, the obscure trials which can be told to none. He loves as well as knows, and looks upon no griefs that he will not comfort, nor on any wounds that he is not ready to bind. The psalmist was certain that God had seen, because he had experienced his delivering power, as he goes on with joy to tell. The figure in verse 8 points back to the act of trust in verse 5. How should God let the hand of the enemy close around and crush the spirits which had been entrusted to that same hand? One sees the greedy fingers of the foe drawing themselves together on their prey, as they might upon a fly, but they close on emptiness. Instead of suffering constraint and oppression, the delivered spirit walks free. They who are enclosed in God's hand have ample room there, and an unhindered activity, with the ennobling consciousness of freedom, is the reward of trust. It is inconceivable that any such sunny confidence should be suddenly clouded and followed, as in the third turn of thought, in verses 9 to 13, by such plaintive absorption in the sad realities of present distress. The very remembrance of a brighter past may have sharpened the sense of present trouble. But let it be noted that these complaints are a prayer and not aimless self-pitying wailing. the enumeration of miseries which begin, "Have mercy on me," has a hidden hope, tinging its darkness like the faint flash of sunrise on the early morning clouds. There is no such violent change of tone as some might perceive, but the pleas of the former parts are continued here, which adds to the psalmist's sore need to be God's past and the suppliant's faith, as another reason for Jehovah's help. He begins with the effects of his trouble on himself in body and soul. He passes to its consequences on those around him. And finally he spreads before God its cause, plots against his life. The resemblances to Psalm 6 and to several parts of Jeremiah are very clear. Verses 9 and 10, the physical and mental effects of anxiety are graphically described. Sunken eyes, enfeebled soul, washed body, are gaunt witnesses of his distress. Cares seem to him to have gnawed his very bones to the core, so weak he is. All that he can do is sigh, and worse than all of that, consciousness tells him that his own sin underlies his trouble, and so he is without any inward support. This picture perhaps appears exaggerated to easygoing, prosperous people, but many a sufferer has since recognized himself in it as a mirror, and been thankful for words which gave voice to his pained heart, and cheered him with a sense of companionship in the gloom. Verses 11 and 12 are mainly the description of the oft-repeated experience of friends forsaking the troubled. Because of all my adversaries somewhat anticipates verse 13 in assigning the reason for their cowardly desertion. The three phrases, neighbour, acquaintant, and those who see me without, indicate concentric circles of increasing diameter. The psalmist is in the middle, and around him are first the neighbours who pour reproach on him because of his enemies. Then the wider range of the acquaintances, afraid to have anything to do with one who has such strong and numerous foes. And remotest of all, the people he meets by chance on the way, who run from him, like he was infected and dangerous. They all forsook him and fled. The bitter ingredient mingles in every cup of sorrow. The meanness of human nature and the selfishness of many a parent of friendship are commonplace. The experience of them is always painful and astonishing, as if nobody beside had ever suffered from them before. In verse 12, this desertion is bitterly summed up, as like the oblivion that waits for the dead. The unsympathetic world goes on its way, and friends find new interests and forget the broken man, who used to be so much to them, as completely as if he were in the grave, or as they do the damaged cup, flung on the rubbish heap. Verse 13 discloses the nature of the calamity which has had these effects. Whispering slanders buzz around him. He is ringed about with causes for fear, since enemies plot his death. The use of the first part of the verse by Jeremiah does not require the hypothesis of his authorship of the psalm, nor of the prophet's ability to be the psalmist. It is always a difficult problem to settle which of the two cases of the employment of the same phrase is the original and which the quotation. The criteria are elastic, and the conclusion is often arrived at in deference to preconceived ideas. But Jeremiah surely uses the phrase as if it were a proverb or a familiar expression, and the psalmist as if it were the freshly struck coin of his own experience. Yet again the key changes, and the minor is modulated into confident petition. It is the test of true trust that it is deepened by the fullest recognition of danger and the enemy. The same facts may feed despair and be the fuel of faith. This man's eyes look in all the surrounding evils, and these drove him to avert his gaze from them and fix it upon Jehovah. That is the best thing a trouble can do for us. If they, on the contrary, monopolize our sight, they turn our hearts to stone. But if we can wrench our eyes away from them, they clear our vision to see our helper. In verses 14 to 18, we have the recoil of the devout soul to God, occasioned by its recognition of need and helplessness. This turn of the stream of the psalm begins with a strong emphatic emphasis. But I trust in Jehovah. We see the man flinging himself into the arms of his God. The word for trust is the same as we find in verse 6 and means to hang or lean upon, or as we might say, to depend upon. He utters his trust in prayer, which occupies the rest of this part of the psalm. A prayer which is the voice of trust does not begin with petition, but with renewed adherence to God and a happy consciousness of the soul's relation to Him, and so melts into supplication for the blessings which are consequences of that relation. To feel on occasion of the very dreariness of circumstances that God is mine makes a miraculous sunrise at midnight. Built on that act of trust claiming its portion in God is recognition of God's all-regulating hand as shaping the psalmist's times, the changing periods, each of which has its own definite character, responsibilities and opportunities. For everyone, life is surely a series of crises in which there is some special work to be done, or perhaps a lesson to be learnt, some particular virtue to be cultivated, or maybe a small sacrifice made. The opportunity will not return. It might have been once, but we missed it and lost it forever. But the psalmist thinks rather of the varying complexion of his days as bright or dark. Looking beyond circumstances, he sees God. The hand of my enemies seems shriveled into impotence when contrasted with the great hand to which he has committed his soul, and in which are his times, and the psalmist's recognition that it holds his destiny is the ground of his prayer for deliverance from the foe's paralyzed grasp. Those who feel the tender clasp of an almighty hand need not doubt their security from hostile assaults. The petitions proper are 3 in number: for deliverance, for the light of God's face, and for salvation. The central petition calls for the priestly blessing. It asks for consciousness of God's friendship and for the demonstration thereof in safety from the present danger. That face, turned in love to a man, can make a sunshine in the shady place, and brings healing to its beams. The prayer passes into assurance of answer, and what was petitioned in verse 1 is now a trusting prediction. I shall not be ashamed, for I cry to you. With like elevation of faith, the psalmist foresees the end of the whispering defamers around him. Shame for their vain plots and their silent descent to the silent land. The loudest outcry against God's lovers will be hushed one day, and the hands that threatened him will lay motionless and stiff across motionless breasts. He who stands by God and looks forward can, by the light of that glorious face, see the end of much transient lustre, with pride and contempt against the righteous. Lying lips will fall dumb. Praying lips, like the psalmist's, are opened to show out God's praise. His prayer is audible still over the millennia subsequent. The mutterings of his enemies only live in his mere passing mention of them. The assurance prepares the way for the noble burst of thanksgiving, as for accomplished deliverance, which ends the psalm, springing up in a joyous outpouring of melody, like a lark from a bare furrow. But there is no such change of tone as to warrant the supposition that these last few verses are either the psalmist's later addition or the work of another, nor do they oblige us to suppose that the whole psalm was written after the peril which it commemorates had passed. Rather, the same voice which triumphantly rings out in these last verses has already been heard in the preceding, even in their saddest strains. The ear catches a twitter, hushed again and renewed more than once, before the full song breaks out. Certainly, the psalmist has been absorbed with his own troubles until now, but his thankfulness expands his vision, and suddenly there is with him a multitude of fellow dependents on God's goodness. He hungers alone, but he feasts in company. The abundance of God's goodness is seen as a treasure stored, and in part openly displayed before the sons of men. The antithesis suggests manifold applications of the contrast, such as the inexhaustible nature of the mercy which, after its revelation, remains unrevealed, and after all expenditure has not diminished its shining mass, as of bullion in some vault, or the varying dealings of God who sometimes, while sorrow is allowed to have its scope, seems to keep his riches of help under lock and key, and then and again flashes them forth in deeds of deliverance. Or the difference between the partial unfolding of these on earth and the full endowment of his servants with riches in glory. All these carry the one lesson, that there is more in God than any creature or creatures have ever drawn from him or can ever draw. The repetition of the idea of hiding in verse 20 is a true touch of real devout poetry. The same word is used for laying up treasure and for sheltering in a pavilion from the jangle of tongues. The wealth and the poor men who need it are stored together, as it were, and the place where they are is safe with God himself. How can they be poor, those who are dwelling close beside infinite riches? The psalmist has just prayed that God would make his face shine upon him, and now he rejoices in the assurance of the answer, knowing himself and all like-minded people to be hidden in that glorious privacy of light, where evil things cannot live. As if caught up and clothed with the sun, he and they are beyond the reach of any hostile conspiracy, and have outsoared the shadow of earth's antagonisms. The great thought of security in God has never been more nobly expressed than in that magnificent metaphor of the light inaccessible, streaming from God's face to be the bulwark of a poor man. The personal tone recurs for a moment in verses 21 and 22, in which is it doubtful whether we hear thankfulness for deliverance anticipated as certain and so spoken of as past, since it is as good as done, or for some more recently experienced marvel of loving kindness, which heartens the psalmist in present trouble. If this psalm is David's, the reference may be to his finding a city of refuge in a time when his fortunes were at a very low ebb. In Ziklag, perhaps, a strange place for a Jewish fugitive to be sheltered. One can scarcely help feeling that the allusion is so specific as to suggest historical fact as its basis. At the same time, it must be admitted that the expression may be carrying on the metaphor of the hiding in a pavilion. The strong city may well be interpreted as God himself, though the historical explanation is tempting. God's mercy makes a true man ashamed of his doubts, and therefore the thanksgiving of verse 21 leads to the confession in verse 22. Agitated into despair, the psalmist had thought that he was cut off from God's eyes, hidden so as not to be helped. But the event has showed that God both heard and saw him. If alarm does not so make us think that God is blind to our need and deaf to our cry as to make us dumb, we shall truly be taught the folly of our fears by his answers to our prayer. These will have a voice of gentle rebuke and ask us, O thou of little faith, why did you doubt? He delivers first and lets the deliverance stand in place of chiding. The whole psalm closes with a summons to all whom Jehovah loves to love him for his mercy's sake. The joyful singer longs for a chorus to join his single voice, as all devout hearts do. He generalizes his own experience, as all who have for themselves experienced deliverance are entitled and bound to do, discerning that in his single case the broad law is attested that the faithful are guarded, whatever danger might assail, and the proud doer abundantly repaid for all his contempt and hatred of the just. Therefore, the last result of contemplating God's ways with his servants is an incentive to courage, strength, and patient waiting for the Lord. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.